right, let's jump into our deep dive today. And we are going way back in time to explore a letter written by Paul, a major figure in early Christianity. We're going to be focusing on his letter to Titus, specifically the section that's known as the Book of Titus.
Okay.
Now imagine getting a letter like this. It's essentially Paul just giving Titus instructions on how to set up like a community of believers on the island of Crete.
Yeah, it's really more than just instructions, though. It's like getting a glimpse into those very early stages of how they organized the church, the nuts and bolts of how you actually go about building a community around beliefs that you share.
Right, and Paul tells Titus to set in order the remaining matters, which, I mean, that sounds pretty vague, right?
Yeah.
What do you think he meant by that?
Well, essentially, Titus was sent to Crete to finish setting up the church structure there.
Okay.
Part of that was appointing elders in every town.
Right.
So basically establishing that local leadership.
So like building the foundation of the community.
Yeah.
But finding the right people for those leadership roles.
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been tricky. Did Paul just say, pick whoever you think is good?
Not quite. He actually lays out some very specific qualifications for those elders. And what's interesting is it's not just about knowing all the scriptures really well.
Okay.
Paul put a lot of emphasis on personal character.
Okay, so what kind of qualities was he looking for?
Well, he mentions being blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children. So it seems that family life played a big role in determining if a leader was actually suitable.
Interesting. And it wasn't just about appearing respectable. It goes a little deeper than that, right?
It does. Think about the culture back then in Crete.
Right.
You know, it was a society that really valued honor and loyalty, especially within families. So if a leader couldn't demonstrate those qualities in their own home, how could they really be trusted to lead an entire community?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So it's almost like Paul saying leadership starts at home.
Exactly. And it kind of highlights this idea that being a leader isn't just about having authority. It's about embodying the values you're actually preaching,
Right.
even in your own personal life.
That's a great point. So what other qualities did Paul emphasize?
Well, he mentions things like being hospitable, just devout and sensible. You know, it's like he's painting a picture of someone who's really ethical and trustworthy.
It sounds like Paul had some pretty high standards.
He did.
But, you know, Crete wasn't exactly known for being this like peaceful haven, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even Paul himself quotes a Cretan prophet who basically says Cretans are always liars.
That's right. And he even warns Titus about these rebellious people, idle talkers and deceivers. These were individuals that were spreading false teachings, and that was really causing a lot of problems within the community.
Wow. So it wasn't all smooth sailing for Titus.
No.
Did Paul give him any advice on how to deal with these troublemakers?
He absolutely did. Paul was really concerned about protecting the integrity of the community's beliefs. He instructs Titus to rebuke them sharply to silence those that are spreading these harmful ideas.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about shutting down dissent.
What else was he trying to do?
Well, Paul emphasizes the importance of sound doctrine and clear communication. He wanted to make sure that the message being taught was accurate and really consistent with the true gospel.
Makes sense. If you're trying to build a strong community, you need to have like a solid foundation of beliefs that you all share.
Right.
But who exactly were these people that were spreading these false teachings? And what exactly were they teaching?
Well, the letter doesn't give us very specific details.
Okay.
But historical context can give us some clues. You know, back then there were all these different ideas floating around about who Jesus was and what his message meant. Some of those ideas might have blended Christian teachings with like elements of Jewish mysticism or Greek philosophy.
So it was like a melting pot of ideas.
Yeah.
And not all of them really aligned with what Paul considered to be the true Christian message.
Exactly. And all these different interpretations could lead to confusion and division within the community.
Right. So Paul was basically trying to nip those issues in the bud before they caused too much damage.
Precisely. He wanted to ensure that the community in Crete was built on a solid foundation of shared beliefs.
Right. And we've talked a lot about leadership and false teachings, but, you know, this letter actually goes beyond those kind of big picture issues.
Yeah.
It gets into nitty-gritty of how different people within the community should actually live their lives.
That's right. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore Paul's advice for specific groups within the community and what that tells us about the social dynamics of the early church.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive into Paul's letter to Titus. We've been unpacking, you know, all the challenges of establishing this brand new community of believers on the island of Crete, which we learned was not exactly known for its tranquility.
Yeah, it's true. And amidst all those challenges, Paul doesn't just focus on, that big picture of leadership and doctrine. He gets into the details of daily life. He provides guidance on how different groups within that community should actually behave.
It's like he's creating a blueprint.
Yeah.
Not just for what they should believe, but how those beliefs should play out and how they interact with one another.
Exactly. And it gives us this really fascinating window into the social dynamics of the early church.
Right. So let's dive into some of those specific instructions.
Okay.
We touched on qualifications for elders in the last part. But what about other members of the community? Where do they fit into this blueprint?
Well, Paul addresses various groups, including older women, younger men, and even slaves.
Wow.
Offering this tailored advice for each of them.
Okay, let's start with the women.
Okay.
What kind of guidance does Paul offer them?
Well, when it comes to the older women, Paul really encourages them to be role models for the younger women. He urges them to teach the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, and to manage their households well.
Yeah, those instructions definitely reflect those social norms of the time, right? Where a woman's primary sphere was often considered to be the home.
Right. And while those roles might seem very limited from our perspective today, it's important to remember that within the context of their culture, those roles carried significant weight and responsibility.
So it's less about prescribing this rigid set of roles and more about applying those timeless principles like responsibility and self-control to the context of their lives.
That's a great way to put it. And it's really interesting to note that Paul places a high value on the older women's ability to mentor and guide that younger generation.
Right. It suggests this recognition of the wisdom and experience that comes with age.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of those intergenerational relationships within the community.
So we've talked about the older women, but what about the younger women? What kind of advice does Paul offer to them?
He echoes a lot of similar themes, urging them to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure.
Okay.
And to be busy at home. It's clear that Paul sees the family unit as a foundational element of a healthy community.
Right. A stable family life would have contributed to the stability of the community as a whole.
Yeah.
But it does raise some questions about the roles and expectations that were placed on women in the early church.
Absolutely. It's so crucial to engage with these texts thoughtfully,
right,
acknowledging that historical context, while also really critically examining the implications for our own understanding of gender roles and expectations today.
Right. It's a reminder that these texts were written in a specific time and place, and our interpretation needs to take that into account.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes studying these texts so fascinating. They challenge us to wrestle with these complex issues and to consider how our own values and perspectives shape our own understanding.
So we've explored Paul's advice for women, but what about the men? What kind of guidance does he offer them?
Well, he specifically addresses younger men, urging them to be self-controlled. And this theme of self-control, it seems to be a recurring one throughout the entire letter.
It makes you wonder why Paul felt the need to emphasize it so strongly.
Yeah, perhaps he recognized that self-control was a virtue that was particularly challenging.
Right.
Especially for young men in a culture that often glorified strength and power.
And it's not just about personal restraint either. It connects to leadership as well, right?
Absolutely. Paul encourages Titus to lead by example, to be this model of good works, and to demonstrate the self-control that he was advocating for in others.
So it highlights this idea that true leadership involves embodying the qualities you want to see in those you lead.
Precisely, and it's a powerful reminder for us today that our actions often speak louder than words.
So beyond self-control, what other advice does Paul offer to the younger men?
He encourages them to be examples of good works in every way.
Okay.
To be sincere and dignified, and to have a message that is sound and above reproach.
It's almost like he's preparing them for future leadership roles.
Right.
Equipping them with the character and skills that are necessary to actually guide the community.
It suggests this long-term vision for the sustainability of the church in Crete.
Yes, Paul isn't just focused on those immediate challenges.
Right.
He's really thinking about the future of that community and investing in that next generation of leaders.
We've covered the instructions for older and younger women and men, but there's another group that Paul addresses that raises some particularly complex issues.
You're talking about the instructions regarding slaves.
Yes, this is a very sensitive topic,
Yeah.
especially when viewed through a modern lens.
Absolutely. It's so crucial to approach this passage with both sensitivity and deep understanding of the historical context. Slavery was a deeply entrenched institution in the Roman world.
Right.
And Paul was addressing a reality that was very different from our own.
So what kind of guidance does Paul offer in this regard? He instructs slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to be obedient and not to talk back.
That's certainly a challenging passage to grapple with.
Yeah.
Especially given our modern understanding of human rights and equality.
It is, and while it's important to acknowledge that historical context, it's also really crucial to engage with the ethical dilemmas that this passage presents.
Yeah, how do we reconcile this instruction with our contemporary values?
Yeah, it's a question that has no easy answers, but it forces us to confront the complexities of interpreting ancient texts and applying them to our modern world.
It highlights this need for ongoing dialogue and thoughtful engagement with these texts.
Yeah.
So even amidst these challenging instructions, what overall message do you think Paul's trying to convey?
I think despite these specific circumstances that he's addressing, Paul's overarching message is about living a life of integrity and faithfulness, regardless of your social standing or your circumstances.
It's about finding ways to honor God and live out your beliefs, even in situations that are less than ideal.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that true faithfulness isn't just this passive submission. It's about actively demonstrating your commitment to God through your actions and your character.
So even in the midst of giving instructions that we might find difficult to accept today,
Yeah.
Paul's still emphasizing that importance of living a life that aligns with your beliefs.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that the application of faith can look different in different contexts, but the core principle of striving to live in accordance with your beliefs, that remains constant.
We've covered a lot of ground in this section,
Yeah.
exploring Paul's advice for various groups within the community, and it's clear that he was concerned with not just establishing a community of shared beliefs,
Right.
but with shaping how those beliefs were actually lived out in the day-to-day lives of its members.
And it's fascinating to see how he weaves together practical advice, spiritual encouragement, and that clear vision for what it means to actually be a follower of Christ in this complex and often challenging world.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how Paul brings all of these themes together in those concluding remarks to Titus. We'll see how he wraps up this letter of instruction and what lasting message he wants to leave with his friend and coworker. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Paul's letter to Titus. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we?
It has been.
From the big picture of establishing a church in Crete to the really nitty-gritty details of how people should live in that community. And now as we reach the end of this letter, I'm so curious to see how Paul wraps things up. Does he give any parting words of wisdom to Titus?
He does, and it's interesting because the tone kind of shifts a bit.
Okay.
We move from the instructional to something that feels much more personal.
Oh, in what way?
Well, for one thing, Paul tells Titus to join him in Nicopolis, where he plans to spend the winter. It's like we're getting a glimpse into their actual friendship,
Right.
A reminder that this was a real relationship between two people working together.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that these ancient figures had real lives and relationships beyond what we read in the scripture.
Exactly. It humanizes Paul in a way.
Right.
Reminding us that he wasn't just this theologian writing abstract letters. He was a mentor, a friend, someone who cared about the people he was working with.
It's not just a letter of instructions then.
No.
It's a letter from one friend to another.
Right, and even in these more personal instructions, there's still this sense of purpose. Paul's not just inviting Titus for a winter getaway.
Right.
He gives him a few tasks to complete before they meet up.
Oh, what kind of tasks?
Well, he mentions needing to send Zenas, who was a lawyer,
And
Apollos, another really prominent figure in that early church, on a journey, and asks Titus to make sure that they have everything that they need.
It's a reminder that leadership isn't just about delegating, but it's also about serving others. Even in those seemingly mundane details of travel arrangements.
Exactly, and it really reinforces this idea that Paul was building this network of people working together, supporting each other in their mission.
It's like we're seeing the early church in action, not just as a collection of beliefs, but as a community of people actually striving toward a common goal.
Precisely. And as Paul concludes his letter, he brings all of this together
Okay.
with a powerful reminder of what it really means to live a life that reflects the gospel.
How so?
He emphasizes the importance of good works, and not as a way to earn salvation,
Right.
but as like the natural outflow of a transformed life. It's a call to action. It's an encouragement to live out your faith in tangible ways.
He doesn't want them to just talk the talk.
No.
He wants them to walk the walk.
Right. He uses this beautiful image of bearing fruit. He doesn't want them to be unfruitful.
Right.
He wants their lives to show the growth and abundance that comes from following Christ.
It's a great metaphor. It's not enough to just be part of the vine. You have to actually produce something.
Yes. And that fruit, in this case, is a life that actually reflects the love and grace of God. And then, after all of this, he ends the letter with this very simple, but really profound statement. Grace be with you all.
Yeah, it's like he's coming full circle, We started with grace, this idea of God's unmerited favor, and we end with grace.
Right. It's a reminder that grace isn't just this theological concept.
Right.
It's a sustaining force, something that empowers us to live our lives in a way that honors God.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Paul's letter to Titus.
It has been a journey.
It's been incredible.
Right.
Going through all these challenges and complexities of building this community of faith, what are your final thoughts on this letter?
I think it's a powerful reminder that the Christian faith isn't just about believing certain things. Right. It's about living those beliefs out in the real world, in those messy relationships and everyday challenges.
It's about taking those ancient words and finding ways to actually apply them to our modern lives.
Exactly. And I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to do just that, to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the wisdom that can be found in these ancient texts.
I love it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking and keep growing.